Night was falling, increasing the cold and the Ukrainians' urgency to finish the mission. They moved from hole to hole, searching for the Russians in the trench. The reconnaissance group walked inside enemy territory, throwing grenades and setting fire to every place where someone could be hiding. The 93rd Ukrainian Brigade sent its tanks to blow up the defenses where the Russians were entrenched. The cannons opened fire on the enemies, even under the risk of kamikaze drones. The Russians counterattacked with their helicopters flying low to spread their rockets over the region defended by the 93rd. Kremlin planes made free flights over the village, bombing the houses where the Ukrainians were hiding. It was the battle towards Chazyvyar with the advance of the Russian paratroopers and the defense of the Ukrainian brigades. The battle for Chazyvyar persisted in the fields of Donetsk in April and May of 2024. Until that moment, the Russians had advanced from Bakhmut, deploying their paratroopers and Stormzy troops in a progression whose flames lit up the night and exposed flesh and bones during the day. But the Ukrainians resisted the whole time, even with the lack of ammunition and the fact that NATO forces were slow to send the new aid packages. The Americans' political battles dragged on for months, and meanwhile, Kyiv's brigades kept up their efforts to keep Chazyvyar out of Russian hands. Chazyvyar presented itself as a major obstacle for the Russian forces. Unlike neighboring Bakhmut, which had already fallen a year earlier, Chazyvyar occupied a higher and more easily defensible position, giving Ukrainian troops a significant advantage. If Russia managed to take Chazyvyar, their vantage point would be devastating. They could launch a series of attacks downhill, threatening the city of Konstantinivka, Bruskivka, and the important provincial centers of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. This Russian advance had been happening. Despite all the disputes over information, everything indicated that the 98th Guards Airborne Division had taken Ivanisk, mainly using the forces of the 331st Regiment, which brought them closer and closer to Sewa. Further north, the paratroopers of the 217th and 299th Regiments were tasked with taking the village of Bodanivka. With reinforcements, it was said that more than 25,000 Kremlin soldiers headed to the region. Bodanivka was located just 5 kilometers from Bakhmut, which had become a Russian fortress. In those months, there was no hope of retaking it, and from those destroyed buildings, the Russians launched their attacks to take the village and move on to their main destination, Chazyvyar. The troops of the 98th and the 1st Army Corps wasted no time in their work, shelling the Ukrainians during the night. Watching from the drones, seeing a group of them so close was too much of a temptation for the artillery. The men from Kyiv hid in shelters during the day, sometimes having some well-prepared ones, but with just enough space for a grenade to get in. It exploded in a dark, foul-smelling hole, deafening the soldiers. Smoke filled the place. It shook the men. They struggled to get out of the debris and the defenses they had prepared, afraid that a new grenade would fall at that moment. The attack made them run scared to new positions. Those soldiers had been brought there by men like a fighter with the war name Sul from the 93 Mechanized Brigade. In the armed forces since 2014, Sul would leave the warm basement to feel the cold winds of winter and death outside, looking at men who would risk their lives for 9 days in the new positions. The rotations were dangerous. The men carried what they could, which made them slower. He thought about his sons traversing terrain that never made walking easy. Even though they left under the cover of night, the sun ended up finding them hours later. And with the light, the Russians could see them even more easily. It was terror for Sul. He had been doing his job since the last colleague lost his leg during a bombing on this route. When the fire fell, all that was left was for each one to find shelter and hope that the finger of death wasn't pointing at their body that day. Terror spread among the men, desperate as the sound of destruction spread across the land and through the air. Some tried to move, but the accurate shots put an end to their progress. Watching those men die before even reaching their goal was even sadder. Worse was the feeling of leading them to their deaths, like Charon on his boat taking souls to the world of the dead. Of course, many made it to the trenches and took shelter in their bunkers. There, the suffering still persisted. Only those who had been in a trench knew what it was to suffer. When he was forced to stay in one of them, he became very familiar with the Russian strategies, which became more and more precise over the years of war. It was nothing like their madness in 2022. Their bombs targeted the bunkers. The earth rose with a terrible sound reaching inside the holes. The tanks came next, firing their machine guns full of Russian paratroopers on top, or ex-prisoners from Storm Z and Storm 5. It was an assault wave, with so many armored vehicles also passing close to the tree lines. The plains were filled with the noise of gunfire. Some disembarked in the middle of the fields, getting ready to run toward the sunlit position. The advance began in his direction. There were many bears moving through the dry grass while their machines retreated. The shots joined above the trees, trying to reach the Ukrainian positions. Part of the troops moving near the tree lines also disembarked while their transport propelled their ammunition. The smoke spread across the field. Sul and the others grew tense, preparing the first defenses right at the junction of the tree lines. The artillery barrage persisted while the Russians were still at a safe distance. The Ukrainians fired their rifles. The smoke coming from the barrels gave the Russians an opening, and the artillery corrected their fire with the information. They kept defending themselves, even with their RPGs flying between the dry branches. The Russians responded with increasingly accurate artillery. What saved many of the Ukrainian soldiers from the Russian paratroopers' attacks was the artillery protection on the sides of Chazyvyar and Bodanivka. The enemies gathered around the armored vehicle. A well-aimed Stugna P missile broke up the gathering and sent the Russians fleeing. It was the kind of relief that Sul felt, seeing the enemies running away and not toward him. The artillery fell heavily on the Russians, driving those lost men away from their transports. Many fled, but others were left lying on the ground. Those who strayed tried to find new hiding places, but the drones picked up the scent of their fear and quickly flew in to blow up their lives. The soldier pressed himself against the wall as much as he could, but the drone made its way. Another came after, searching for the same flesh to make sure the first one hadn't been effective. It noticed the burning smell of life and was satisfied, looking for another face to consume. Sol retreated from some positions, held a few, but eventually ended up in the basement in Bodanivka. He got there but without peace. It was enough to step outside to show something to someone, for the faces to bombard the place. The armored vehicles parked nearby were hit by Lancer drones, a curse that kept descending upon them. In the end, he ended up in the basement again, seeing that there were so many messages from his children asking, "Dad, are you still alive?" Ivan Alexandrovich was born in the Altai territory, more precisely in Novo-Altais. He joined the 217th Regiment of the 98th Airborne Division in 2010. Of the 98th Airborne Division in 2010, he served in Crimea and Syria, forging his soul for combat in different territories. It was good to be back in Ukraine, seeing the kamikaze drones becoming more and more efficient that winter. They kept the Ukrainians warm in the trenches to the point that, when Ivan moved with his men to capture the defenses towards Bodanivka, he walked through the snow as if it were a stroll, enjoying the scenery and thinking about life. His job was just to check the twisted bodies in the holes. The drones made the job much easier. They found the Ukrainians' anti-tank guided missile positions, which allowed the artillery to eliminate that threat to the tanks and other armored vehicles that would take them into combat. It was also nice to see Dusk getting ready to level the enemy hideouts in Boranivka, the village that was an obstacle for the paratroopers moving toward Chazyvyar. The 240mm mortar was designed to destroy fortified objects, buildings, fortifications, concentrations of enemy personnel, and armored vehicles. He operated in cooperation with drone operators and other means of detection and target designation. The preparation, aiming, and firing of the mortar were carried out automatically in up to 3 minutes, with a destruction range of up to 20 kilometers depending on the ammunition used. The explosions were terrible, certainly causing weeping in so many families loyal to Kiev. Ivan Alexandrovich was a sergeant proud of his soldiers' work. During a blizzard that seemed like a punishment, he and his men advanced in armored vehicles. The gunfire put the Ukrainians in defensive positions, coming out of their holes to shoot. The Russians stayed on the snow, slowly approaching with their rifles crawling on the white ground. More of them got out of the armored vehicles, putting the whole squad to fight the enemies among the trenches. Most of the Ukrainians got trapped in the crossfire, but one of them managed to escape, leaving footprints marking the path to his salvation. One of the armored vehicles filled the area with smoke and made the terrain darker for the paratroopers to advance. In the end, the pressure drove the opponents out of their frozen hideouts and sent them fleeing through the snowstorm. On days when the snow didn't fall so heavily, life was better. The problem was that the drones also flew much more. Some of them reached Ivan and his men's position. It was a surprise when the first grenade fell on one of them, exploding on his back. Other distracted ones were caught the same way. The explosives fell inside the shelters. Ivan saw the wounded troops and tried to help one of his men. The drone found them. The sergeant's effort was ended by a grenade, adding 2 more deaths to the day's count. A medal from the Order of Courage and a corpse were delivered back to Thais. The Ukrainians were heading out for the attack. Men like Harrowing fought in the trenches all this time. He left Kharkiv after the bears bombed everything in Saltivka. He lost his home in one of those moments when the bombs fell. After that, with his face burned and covered in dirt, he lived and relived those moments in the same basement where Sol was. He was the one who had shown the way to the trenches where Harrowing had been. The SPG-9S were used in the bear positions just ahead from where Harrowing could hear their voices. The equipment fired very well at about 8,000 meters. The soldier thought that maybe the bears weren't even that far away when he saw the 73mm shells explode in the trees ahead. In one of the assaults on one of these positions, near Bodanivka, the reconnaissance unit of the 93rd took the lead. The 93rd had many men whose spirits had been hardened by the fighting in Baku. They moved among the trees, alert for drones that might be there to spy for the Russians or to drop their grenades. They entered increasingly open ground, where the tree line had been almost completely destroyed by artillery. The Russians were there, hiding in any hole, waiting to give them a mushroom-shaped present right in the forehead. It was about to get dark, and they needed to be quick. The first grenade landed in an enemy shelter. The men approached, aiming their rifles. One of them assessed the situation and sent a grenade into the darkness. After that, they moved on more quickly. The smoke from the grenades was light, not enough to cover the colors of the sky at sunset. Out of breath, they ran to the Russian holes surrounding the entrances. They put their rifles to work, none of them the typical ones from each region. The shots added more smoke to the effect of the grenades. They increasingly surrounded the enemy's exits, cutting off their routes of hope. Smoke came out of the rifles, and the Russians, surrounded inside the holes, saw the earth jump under the impact of the projectiles. The soldiers of the 93 had surrounded the hideout. One of them approached with a grenade and threw the torment at the enemy. The explosives filled the landscape with smoke, detonating some of the Russian ammunition and burning what was inside the holes. The sun was going away, tired from the combat and knowing it would illuminate some bodies tomorrow one way or another. The flashlights turned on toward the Russians' holes, aiming the rifles to throw ammunition at anyone still taking cover. The men ran across the devastated land, throwing grenades that would add a bit more to the destruction. The explosions filled the twilight with smoke. The Russian hideouts were filled with flames that consumed the accumulated trash and the corpses of those who couldn't escape. Men trapped in the midst of flames and smoke felt the metal from enemy barrels adding to their torment. Night had almost fully arrived to witness the soldiers' work. A sun bid farewell to the men, tired of yet another day seeing corpses become part of the landscape. Night came with cold to preserve the dead flesh until someone could recover those bodies. Harrowing saw a lot of Russian flesh thrown in front of the trenches, especially from the storms in. They followed the strategy of attack waves. They were small groups supported by armored vehicles coming in sequence. That's how they faced Bacchus's mercenaries. Some of their attacks were intercepted during the night, one of the most dangerous times when the defenders' exhaustion threatened to be the cause of defeat. The drones spotted the bears walking among the trees before they reached Rarion's position. The cluster munitions scattered around the group, creating a circle of suffering and death. Some of them were further behind and were greeted by the artillery. Many of those who remained still chose to continue the attack. The defenders had already put their weapons into action, firing into the darkness at anything that moved among the trees. A bit of the flames resulting from the explosion still helped to illuminate, but most of the shots were just to keep the enemy away. When he returned to the basement, Harrowing could hear the Russians getting closer and closer. He has lived in shelters since the Kremlin bombed his house. There, he received the summons and gladly accepted it. Now he heard the kamikaze drones entering other people's houses and demolishing them in the same way. It was sad, but it was the war he had been a part of since the first Russian soldiers set foot on Ukrainian soil. The planes flew over Bodanivka, dropping their bombs. Those Su-25s flew low to unleash destruction on the tree lines and the village. A carpet of fire formed on the ground in a sequence of explosions that made the Russians celebrate from afar. That free flight was a scourge the Ukrainians couldn't get rid of without effective air defense. Much of that protective network had been destroyed by the Kremlin's paratroopers in their advance. Nazarov Evgeny was almost a grandfather to the younger paratroopers. He smiled when he saw the helicopters flying over Bodanivka. They were dangerous maneuvers adorned with live ammunition. The rockets made the sight even more beautiful for those outside that attack. For all the men of the 98, it was only a matter of time before Bodanivka fell and they could continue on the path to the main objective. Nazarov was in good spirits and believed in that. His own daughter always described him that way, good-humored, hopeful. The ground of the Ukrainians, covered with fire and smoke, gave even more energy to that hope. It was to finish the work there and leave. Almost at the end of winter, the 217th and 299th regiments had already gotten very close to Bodanivka. This gave even more freedom for their forces to destroy the houses where the Ukrainians were hiding. The buildings fell like domino pieces lined up. A Ukrainian was almost killed, lucky to be outside at the moment of impact. Nazarov got ready along with his colleagues for the moment of a final assault on the village. The 93rd Brigade of the Ukrainians would have to retreat from a place where they no longer had any protection. The paratrooper also noticed the decrease in the rate of their artillery fire, an indication that NATO really wasn't helping Kyiv at that time. Without that, they would fall and he would return home with his patriotic duty fulfilled. But the 93 was persistent. They were used to the worst surprises that war could offer. No one who fought in Bakhmut didn't have that written on their soul. Their tanks got ready and moved out to bombard a Russian position, knowing the risks from drones. The shots tormented Nazarov's trench. He waited for the drones to appear and devour the metal of the armored vehicles. But all that appeared were more shots from the Ukrainians. It was endless minutes in which the fire stirred the dry trees. Only afterwards did the tanks leave, leaving behind fire and bodies. Nazarov was still alive, supporting the younger ones. At 53 years old, he had this commitment to them. Kamikaze drones also appeared in the trench. It wasn't anything new, but they caused the same terror as if it were the first time. They exploded in every hole they found. They broke through the defenses, as if challenging the Russian hope of taking Bodanivka. The soldier had no rest, and often the war didn't even allow him to have dignity. And the man was lashed by terror even in his least dignified moments, having to run desperately as soon as he saw a drone. When the Ukrainian soldiers began their assault on the trench, the men prepared their RPGs and came out of the holes looking for targets. There was something about preventing them from being productive. They fired once, but after that, grenades started to fall until they lost the energy to leave the shelter. The infantry tried to sneak up on the Russian positions. Nazarov and his men defended themselves with what they had, using machine guns, rifles, and grenades, keeping their opponents pinned down. They arrived crouching low beside the tree line. Answering Nazarov's prayers, the artillery finally woke up and began to act. The explosions filled the Ukrainians with trouble. They fell right on top of them many times. What didn't hit their bodies directly created waves of shrapnel that left wounded men slowly turning into corpses in front of the Russian defenses. The explosions over Bodanivka increased over the months. The Ukrainians had little with which to defend themselves against the aggressiveness of the Russians. The swarm of kamikaze drones descended on the village, operated by men satisfied with the continuous advance. What was left standing was blown up. They left only smoke and rubble wherever they flew. The Ukrainians even moved an S-300 air defense system closer in an attempt to stop the planes and their bombs. It was found by drones and destroyed along with other similar equipment that was taken out as the 98th Division advanced. The Ukrainian 93rd Brigade had to retreat from Bodanivka to regroup in more defensible positions. The defeat was acknowledged later, and by April 2024 the Russians already had control over the area. The Russian flag had already been placed on the eastern outskirts of the city weeks earlier, but with the entry into the village, Nazarov became even happier. Now, with the confirmation, he could write to his daughter. However, there would still be much more to tell. That battle around Bodanivka isn't over. Any man who smiles in war with hope, still seeing the fire burning with his own eyes and smelling the corpses, doesn't know the risk he's taking. War does not forgive the soldier who sleeps, the mind that hesitates, or the heart that dreams. Wait for the next part.